Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 73, which will explore animal form and function. This is the first episode of my second series on animal physiology, which will continue to explore the various fundamental aspects of the animal body that I just couldn't fit into the first series. Compared to plants and fungi, animals are relatively complex. Animals have a greater variety and a complexity of their tissues, and unlike both plants and fungi, animals are extremely mobile and can easily move around their landscape. Because of this relative complexity, there's much more stuff that I have to cover here to fully explore the basics of animals, hence this second series. After this, I'll start exploring the orders and families of the kingdom Animalia itself. If that sounds cool to you, then awesome, let's get started. So where the first episode was about animal development, this second episode will explore animal form and function, the form and function of the mature animal's body. This means tissues and organs, adaptations and life strategies, body size, homeostasis, all of that good stuff. Because all of this is very fundamental, you'll be able to take a lot of the information that you learn here today from this episode and apply it to the previous 6 episodes. So if you listen to this one, if you listen to episode 73, and then you go back and listen to the entire series of Animal Physiology 1 with all of this new information in mind, chances are you'll have a better grasp of the information. You'll make more connections between all of the little details, and it will help you understand the material as a whole better. Now, with all of this housekeeping out of the way, it's time to begin. Animal form and function, or to put it another way, their anatomy and physiology, is the product of evolution and countless adaptations that allow each individual animal species to fit perfectly into their environments, into their ecological niche. For any given animal, the environment is a wilderness of both biological and physical, non-living variables. And these variables, be they threats from the landscape or from other animals, dangers, whether they be opportunities, a new feeding ground or a new reproductive mate, all of these variables are all influencing the animal's evolution. Virtually every variable, be it temperature, humidity, the presence of a particular microbial pathogen, a seasonal change, whatever it is, as long as these variables somehow influence the animal's survival rates and their rates of reproduction, then these variables will apply selection pressures onto the animal populations. Now, as these animal populations respond evolutionarily to these pressures, their bodies will change. Adaptations that are useful are preserved, and less useful traits are minimized. They're retooled, or they're just lost entirely. The adaptations that are preserved allow the animal population to survive better and to reproduce with higher chances of success within whichever environment they happen to live. As time goes on and these adaptations accumulate, and as traits that aren't helpful in the environment are stripped away or repurposed, the animal's morphology changes. The animal population is molded into its environment so that it can thrive there, wherever it happens to be. This capacity for adaptation is powerful, and it's created the diversity and the geographic distribution of all of the life that we see today. However, it's important to understand that adaptations to a specific environment are just that. They're adaptations to a specific environment. This specific environment is the historical and ancestral home of the animal species. If an individual animal or an animal population were to be extracted from their native habitat and then transplanted somewhere else, they wouldn't have that many adaptations and traits that are useful in their new environment. All of their traits were evolved to deal with their native environment, where their populations and their ancestors have lived for thousands or millions of years. They wouldn't have that many adaptations and traits that are useful in their new environment because they've spent no time adapting to it. All their traits were evolved to deal with their native environment, and so any benefits or advantages that those traits gave to the animals while in their native environment, those benefits are now impaired, and the advantages might be totally lost when the animal is put into a new and unfamiliar environment. In some cases, both an old and a new environment may be relatively similar, like the islands off of the southern coast of India when compared to the Hawaiian Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. These are very distant, geographically speaking, but ecologically they're roughly similar. Same temperature, same humidity, give or take, that kind of thing. These similar environments would likely create similar evolutionary pressures, as there's similar habitat variables that would influence the resident animal populations in the same way. The organisms that evolved native to each environment, they might evolve very similar strategies for finding food, or evading predators, or they might evolve very similar morphologies for catching a similar kind of prey, or to fit into a certain ecological niche. In these cases, the migration or transplantation of an animal from its native environment to the new environment can be stressful, but maybe not outright lethal. The transplanted species may struggle to survive, as it will likely be at a competitive disadvantage compared to the native species. But it's not outright doomed, because the environment just isn't that inhospitable to them. Now, this scenario of animals moving into somewhat similar environments and adapting to them, this scenario really defines the story of life on Earth, as animals and plants and fungi slowly move into a new, barely tolerable environment, into a new, barely tolerable habitat, and over time, they adapt to live there. In some cases, the transplanted species might actually be really successful because there's no native predators or diseases to slow them down, and there's either few or zero native species that can effectively compete with them. This is how invasive species can emerge and spread with ease and destabilize entire ecosystems. To really emphasize the importance of the environment, it doesn't really do a whole lot of good to look at very similar environments, like tropical islands off the coast of India and tropical islands in the Pacific Ocean. There's not much difference here, so you don't really see a very strong effect. And so to really appreciate how important the environment is, it can be helpful to imagine an animal species that's being transplanted into a radically different environment, one that looks nothing like its native environment. For example, imagine a fish that's been adapted to swim aerodynamically and efficiently through the water, and imagine that it's been transplanted into a dry desert like the Sahara. Now imagine a polar bear from the cold, desolate Arctic wastes being transplanted into a dry desert like the Sahara. In both of these cases, the animals would die. The fish would die in minutes. The polar bear, maybe hours, if not a couple days. Now this is because the polar bear and the fish have each evolved adaptations to their specific environments. Adaptations that have been shaped into qualitative traits that are specialized for dealing with all of the variables of their very specific environment. So when you put these animals somewhere very different, their adaptations do them no good at all, and the animal is doomed. The point I'm trying to make here is that adaptations involve fitness trade-offs. Pretty much no adaptation is going to be a universally useful trait. If you name any trait of any animal, there's an environment where that trait isn't useful at all, or it's outright detrimental. For example, having wings is an adaptation in birds and bats. This adaptation opened up a whole new dimension for them. It allowed them to travel in the sky, far above the land and away from all of these four-legged terrestrial predators. It allowed them to hunt from the sky, which gives them a powerful visual advantage. It allows them to migrate over huge distances, and it allows them to bypass difficult or impassable terrain, and to do all sorts of other things. But something that wings are notoriously bad at is digging holes or burrowing into the ground. Wings and feathers are relatively delicate, and they can only scrape away the upper, softer, looser layers of soil. They're absolutely terrible at digging through the more compacted and more root-infused soil below the surface. The bird cannot use its wings to burrow and make a hole in the ground, And ironically, that's how so many rodents and reptiles manage to escape their avian predators. Now, this burrowing trait is itself an adaptation in the rodents and in many reptiles. It's been modified through evolutionary time, so that these animals don't just burrow to escape birds, they burrow for a whole host of reasons, like to make an underground home or a nest, to hibernate and keep warm in the winter, and to escape from other, more terrestrial predators like foxes or cats. While the hands that dig these burrows are very good at this, they're very good at digging through the soil, these hands are very bad at flying. The way I'm describing fitness trade-offs right now is somewhat coarse and superficial. Fitness trade-offs can often be much more elegant and subtle than this. For example, have you ever wondered why an animal will lay X amount of eggs and not X plus 5 or X plus 20? Or have you ever wondered why many animals have 2 eyes when 3 or 4 eyes would provide redundancy for a critically valuable sensory system? The reason that traits and adaptations appear as they do is because there are energy and resource balances that have to be managed. If you'll consider birds again, think about why a hypothetical bird species would lay 2 or 3 eggs at a time, as opposed to 10 or 20. There are fitness trade-offs here. If the bird laid 20 eggs, that would be a huge resource investment. For the mother bird, producing the 20 eggs in the first place would be extremely difficult. It would require a lot of nutrients. If somehow the mother was able to acquire enough nutrition to bring all of these eggs into a state where they could be laid and they were healthy enough to potentially produce a healthy chick, the mother bird would then have to deal with 20 offspring that she has to feed and raise and protect. So now the mother bird doesn't just have to find food for herself, she has to find food for 20 chicks. And if she can't do that, the chicks will start to starve. If the mother bird tries to feed all of her chicks equally, then all of the chicks might be equally malnourished, and all of them would have a similarly low fitness and a similar risk of starving to death. And now if all of the chicks starve to death, or if there's only 1 or 2 weak little sickly chicks that survived their childhood, well, that's a huge amount of time and energy and resources that the mother bird has just wasted. If the mother bird only laid 2 or 3 eggs in the first place, she would only have to feed 2 or 3 chicks, and that's way easier. Because it's way easier to feed a smaller number of chicks, they're each more likely to make it into adulthood with a relatively competitive degree of fitness. This example showcases a fitness trade-off. It shows how the adaptation to produce a smaller number of eggs can actually result in more offspring making it to adulthood, either in proportional terms or absolutely. This concept of energy and resource management is universal. It applies to all animals, to all organisms really, in all aspects of their life. Use of energy and resources is the most physics-based aspect of biology that there is. It's remarkably mathematical. Now, the animals obviously aren't doing math calculations to determine the best life strategies. They're not doing algebra to figure out how many eggs they should lay. But the reality is that evolutionary pressures tend to shape adaptations into energetically harmonious forms, which have a kind of mathematical equilibrium, or a kind of mathematical efficiency. This is perfectly demonstrated by the mother bird laying the optimal amount of eggs. For another example, consider crickets. Crickets reproduce when the male cricket generates a spermatophore, which is then given to the female cricket for her to eat. The spermatophore is basically just a globular gelatinous mass that's been filled with sperm. A packet of sperm is inserted into this gelatinous mass and kind of diffuses through the whole thing. And so as the female eats this spermatophore, the sperm will naturally get ingested, and the sperm will migrate through the female's digestive tract to her reproductive organs, where they then fertilize her eggs. A general trend here is that the longer the female spends eating, the more sperm she ingests. A general trend here is that the longer the female spends eating, the more sperm she consumes, and the more likely the male's sperm is to fertilize her eggs. There are several aspects of this reproductive strategy that involve trade-offs, or a balancing of variables for maximal reproductive success. First of all, consider that it takes the male about 3 hours to generate a decently sized spermatophore, which can end up weighing as much as 6% of his adult body mass. Now, the male can potentially make numerous really small spermatophores that are each individually really quick and easy to produce, but each female that then comes by and eats these tiny spermatophores will only be ingesting a relatively small amount of sperm, and this gives the male cricket a pretty low chance at fertilizing an egg. His chances might be low enough that all of the effort he put into making all of these tiny little spermatophores just isn't worth it. Alternatively, the male can spend many hours making a huge spermatophore, just one single huge spermatophore, and the female will spend just as much time eating it. Now, this kind of spermatophore is very likely to fertilize a female, because the female will be just eating it for so long that she's going to ingest a lot of sperm. But the act of producing such a huge spermatophore in the first place is very time-consuming, and it's very energy-intensive. And during this time, the male cricket makes himself very vulnerable to threats, like predators and diseases. I mean, consider a disease. Consider a pathogen. When a pathogen infects a cricket, the energy that the cricket would need to mount an immune response to protect itself from the pathogen gets siphoned away from the energy being used to make spermatophores. And so if the cricket gets infected while it's making these spermatophores, its body then has to balance the energy that it invests into fighting off the pathogen and the energy that it invests into making effective spermatophores. The most obvious outcome here is that the male cricket will generally make smaller spermatophores because he's spending a lot of energy fighting off the pathogen. Because the male cricket is making generally smaller spermatophores, the female crickets will generally spend less time eating them, and so they'll ingest fewer sperm, and the male will have a lower chance of reproducing. The male cricket has to create spermatophores that are properly sized, so as to optimize the female feeding time, which then will optimize his reproductive success. But in addition to the right size of spermatophore, the male also has to create the right number of spermatophores, so that he has enough numerical opportunities to reproduce with sufficiently viable odds for fertilization. All of these different variables, all of these different risks, and more, all have to be taken into consideration and balanced together as part of a dance of fitness trade-offs. Okay, so now that I've touched on the very basics of this energy investment trade-off aspect of animal evolution, I want to look at the morphological aspects of animals' bodies that offer functional benefits. I want to look at how form implies function, and vice versa. In my opinion, the most strikingly clear and obvious example of this exists in the beaks of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. Each Galapagos island is populated with different species of plants, and all of these plants produce different kinds of seeds. The seeds have different sizes, different shells with varying hardness, and varying nutritional quality. And most importantly, the seeds are a critical source of food for all of the finches that happen to live on that particular island. These finches have adapted to their island homes by evolving beaks that match the type of seed that they have access to. If an island's only available food source is a big, thick kind of seed that has a heavy, hard shell that's difficult to break open, then the only finches who will be able to break them open, and thus the only finches who will be able to get food on this island and survive, will be the finches with the largest, strongest beaks. After generation and generation of this selection pressure, all of the finches on this hypothetical island with large, heavy seeds will now have large, strong beaks. They've been sculpted by evolution to optimally crack open the seeds that they depend on for food. Conversely, some islands had plants that produced smaller, softer seeds. These seeds can clearly be consumed by a finch with a large, strong beak, but because they're small and soft, They can also be consumed by finches with smaller, weaker beaks. Now, on these islands, developing a larger beak is actually deleterious. It's a disadvantage. It's a waste of resources. The finch is investing all of these nutrients and all this chemical energy into growing this big, strong, heavy beak, except it's 5 times more powerful than it needs to be. Evolution tends to avoid over-engineering an organ like this, because it's just a waste of resources. It's not energetically efficient or harmonious. Now, in both of these cases, the finches aren't deliberately engineering their beaks. Obviously. Evolution is. When a mutation appears and creates an allele that produces a slightly larger beak, in environments where that kind of beak is more of an advantage, that allele will generally be preserved in the population. Traits and adaptations will begin to spread throughout a population when the frequency of this allele increases, as individuals with it are better able to survive and reproduce, and thus pass on that allele to the next generation compared to those individuals who don't have that allele in the first place. Alright, I want to shift gears a little bit and start talking about tissues. To be very general, a tissue is a group of cells that all work together. They're all specialized to do the same thing. And when they're all connected in physical proximity, all performing a same task or function, they form a tissue. The simplest kind of tissue is epithelial tissue. The epithelium is composed of tightly packed cells that form a thin layer. Within this layer, there's obviously multiple layers of cells. The outer surface of the epithelium, the outer layer of these cells, is called the apical layer. This is the layer that faces the outside of the body, or that faces an internal organ cavity. And then beneath this, you have the basal layer, or the basolateral layer. And this is the lower surface of the epithelium, and it faces the inside of the body, or it lines the inside of the organ. The basolateral layer tends to be composed of larger cells, and these reproduce rapidly through mitosis. The daughter cells get pushed up towards the apical surface as they age, as they're constantly getting lifted by the new cells that are being continually produced beneath them. When it comes to your skin, or your epidermis, this has an epithelial layer on it that's composed of cells that, as they age and rise up to the apical layer, they dry out into these flat, flaky husks of dead cells. They're flattest, driest, and deadest on the outermost layer of your skin. And here, they provide a degree of mechanical protection. If you're walking through a forest and a tree branch scrapes against you, instead of just puncturing and lacerating your skin, it'll just brush off some of this outer layer of dead cells on your epithelium. Now, the basolateral layer of the epithelium, the lower layer that's connected to a lot of this ground tissue, the deeper tissue, deeper in the body or deeper in the organ, this basolateral layer is anchored to a ground layer of connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is composed of cells that are dispersed in a matrix, like a liquid or a solid, or some kind of gelatinous substance, like cartilage. Different types of connective tissue have different matrices, and they perform significantly different roles in the animal's body depending on the materials that make them up, because this gives them a wide range of different functional properties. Loose connective tissue is relatively loose. It consists of a mass of fibrous structures that are just loosely arranged or tangled together in sheets or layers. Loose connective tissue is soft and fluffy, and it exists below the skin and below the epithelial layers of many organs. Now, in contrast to the loose connective tissue, there's dense connective tissue, and this is composed of collagen fibers that are tightly packed and bundled together to create tissue that's elastic and flexible, but extremely strong. These collagen fibers compose the extracellular matrix of the connective tissue, as they're produced by rows of fibroblast cells that are packed inside of these bundles. They're nestled between the collagen fibers themselves. This dense, strong, and yet flexible tissue forms ligaments and tendons. Ligaments connect bones to bones, often wrapping around and sealing in the cartilage that's positioned between the bones in a joint. And then you have tendons, which just connect the bone to the muscle. Now, the bones themselves are also a kind of connective tissue. Bones are a form of supporting connective tissue, which literally offers physical, structural support and a degree of mechanical protection. The bone itself consists of osteocytes, or bone cells, which all secrete a mixture of mostly calcium phosphate with a little calcium carbonate, and this forms a solid deposit as it's secreted on the outside of these cells. The osteocytes grow together and deposit all of these calcium phosphate salts in such a way that their accumulated activity creates the mature bone. Cartilage is also a supportive connective tissue, but it's composed of chondrocytes, and instead of secreting calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate, the chondrocytes secrete a proteoglycan and an elastin-rich substance. This proteoglycan-rich substance will harden into a rubbery, smooth, elastic cartilage tissue. So loose connective tissue is composed of a soft matrix, like padding or bedding, with loose tangled fibers suspended in a soft gel. Dense connective tissue is composed of a stiffer, harder matrix of parallel rows of collagen fibers. And supportive connective tissue is composed of a solid matrix, like calcium phosphate salts. But there's also a kind of connective tissue that's composed of a pure liquid matrix, where the cells are typically free-floating in this fluid, liquid solution. The blood is a fluid connective tissue, as blood contains cells like erythrocytes that get transported throughout the body's vasculature within the watery plasma blood fluid. Beyond connective tissue, you have the muscle tissue itself, which I talked about in great detail in the previous episode on animal movement. To very briefly summarize, muscle tissue is unique to animals, and it allows for contraction. And when the muscle tissue is built around the proper skeletal framework, this targeted and precise contraction allows the animal to move its body in very specific ways. Skeletal muscle tissue allows the animal to manipulate its limbs so as to move around the environment, and to avoid predators, or to find and eat food, or to find a mate and reproduce with them. Then there's smooth muscle, which wraps around some of the animal's organs, mostly those organs in the digestive tract, where the smooth muscle helps to engage in peristalsis, which can help break down and churn the food and move the food farther down the digestive tract. And then there's cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle exists in the animal's heart, where the regular, paced contractions pump and circulate blood throughout the animal's body. If you imagine me putting together an animal as I describe all of these different tissues and components, so far we would have the bones and the ligaments, we'd have the muscles and tendons, we'd have the blood, and we'd have the epithelial tissue that forms the veins and the skin, and the outer and inner layers of all of the organs. Now, I'll get to the organs in a moment, but first I want to cover the last type of tissue, which innervates everything else. Neural tissue is composed of neurons and their associated entourage of support cells, which function to channel action potentials throughout the animal's body. Nerves are connected to sensor cells in the skin, to sensor cells in the eyes, in the ears, in the tongue, and the nose. These nerves innervate muscle, they connect to veins, and they reach within every single organ. The neural tissue descending from the brain and extending from the spinal cord facilitates sensory perception across the animal's entire body. It facilitates body awareness and homeostasis. To introduce homeostasis, I find myself returning to the same foundational principle that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. Form follows function. The animal's physical shape and its mass has to obey physical rules over heat exchange and the diffusion of nutrients and all sorts of other variables. And so this diversity of evolved biology has all been built along this framework of physical laws. Perhaps most basic is the animal's size. Now size, big or small, may seem like a relatively simple quality, but it's really, really important. Understand that volume increases faster than surface area. If you have a shape of size A, and you increase it however much to size B, as long as it stays the same shape, its volume will increase at a cubed rate, while the surface area will only increase at a squared rate. So volume increases faster than surface area proportionally. What this means for animals is that larger animals will generally retain heat better than smaller animals, as they have more volume to generate heat, but relatively less surface area through which to lose that heat. It's kind of interesting to notice, for example, that animals that live in the Arctic tend to be rather large compared to their more temperate peers, like how moose are much larger than horses, or like how polar bears are much larger than every other type of bear, or how reindeer that live in the boreal tundra tend to be much larger than, for example, a white-tailed deer living in a more temperate habitat. Furthermore, larger animals tend to have a lower basal metabolic rate. The basal metabolic rate is the rate of oxygen consumption of the animal's body measured in unit volume per unit biomass per unit time when the animal is at rest in normal conditions. The fact that larger animals tend to have a slower metabolic rate than smaller animals is partly due to the physical rules of diffusion. In a small animal, like a little gecko or a tiny shrew or a little insect, the volume of their body is small enough, and the surface area of all of their body's tissues are all so closely integrated that nutrients and oxygen and waste products can diffuse across the tissues and across the body relatively easily. Now, this ease of diffusion enables a much faster metabolic rate, as the smaller animals find themselves rapidly burning through their nutrients. The chemical superstructure that is the small animal's little body, it has this metachemical cycle, this metabolism, and it operates much faster in the smaller body than it does in a larger body, in larger animals. In larger animals, tissues are literally larger and they're more spread out. There's less vascularization per unit volume, and so diffusion isn't nearly as feasible an option for moving nutrients and waste around. And it also means that the chemical processes that support the larger animal's body operate at a generally slower pace. In some circumstances, this can actually be a problem for larger organisms. Consider an animal that breathes through its skin, where its skin effectively represents the surface area of its body. The oxygen that it breathes through the surface area of its skin is used to feed the metabolic activity of its cells, which compose its internal volume. Now, if the animal grows too large, this internal volume will increase faster than the surface area, to the point where the diffusion of oxygen across the skin, across the surface area, will not be sufficient to keep all the cells in the body and the volume alive. Salmon, for example, have to deal with this problem as they grow from tiny skin-breathing larvae into an adult, which is a process that sees their body mass increase by a factor of 1,000,000. To deal with this problem caused by growing in size, the salmon transition sometime in their development from skin breathing to gill breathing. The gills are an adaptation that maximizes surface area, so as to aid in respiration in a fluid environment. Now, gills are composed of numerous sheets of cells, called gill lamellea, and the composite structure built of all of these numerous lamellea has a relatively large surface area, which makes the gill ideal for absorbing oxygen out of the water. This rate of absorption is facilitated by the high surface area of the gill lamellea, and this supports the growth of a larger volume, or a larger body size in the fish. Other adaptations to increase surface area involve folding or branching. The digestive system is a great example of folding. Inside of the small intestine, the inner epithelial layers will fold and ripple quite heavily so as to increase their surface area for nutrient absorption. Even on a microscopic level, the epithelium that lines the small intestine is composed of villi and microvilli, and these are small and smaller little pinched out folds in the epithelial surface that greatly increase the surface area. On a macroscopic level, the small intestine is folded and rolled and bundled up into a tight little mass, so that a very long tube can fit into a relatively small space, the abdomen of an animal. Now, with branching patterns, you most often see this in vasculature or in nervous tissue. If you look at a tree, It has a very obvious branching effect. You start with a single large trunk, and as the tree grows upwards, you'll see that it splits into an increasing number of increasingly small branches. Now, the reason that trees have this kind of branching growth form is because it helps them increase their surface area. There's a mathematical harmony here. And for that same reason, we see the same pattern, the same branching structure in our vasculature and our nervous tissue. Consider how large arteries will branch into smaller arterioles, which then branch into even smaller capillaries. Or consider how a thick nerve bundle will branch down into smaller bundles, and then these smaller bundles will branch down again into individual neurons, which kind of feather out and innervate all of the cells in a given region of the body. And all of these neurons all have their own dendrites that branch out to connect in a network or a circuit system with all of these other proximal neurons. In the case of veins, the high surface area of the branching enables a very efficient diffusion of nutrients throughout the body. In the case of neural tissue, this high surface area of the branching enables sufficient innervation of the animal's tissues. So now that I've constructed more or less the entire organism with all of these different layers and tissue types, now I have to describe how all of this works together to keep the animal alive. This is done through a process of maintaining homeostasis, where the internal chemical conditions of the animal's body are maintained so that the animal can stay alive and healthy. Animals have evolved a wide range of mechanisms to maintain their homeostasis, even if the external environment around them is radically changing. There are, generally speaking, two strategies for maintaining homeostasis: conformation and regulation. In conformation, the animal conforms its body to its environment. This is the case for the Arctic rock cod, which lives in the depths of the Arctic Ocean, where the temperature remains relatively constant. Instead of wasting energy trying to maintain a different body temperature, the Arctic rock cod simply allows its body temperature to match that of the ambient water. Now, regulation, on the other hand, is a much more active process. The animal will expend energy to maintain the same internal temperature, regardless of the external temperature, and it does this by engaging in a regulating cellular or behavioral response. For example, if an animal is too hot, it may start to pant, or it may sweat, so as to get rid of excess heat through water evaporation. If an animal is too cold, it may shiver, so as to generate heat through its muscles, or it may burrow into the ground to seek the warmth of soil blanketed in snow. I should point out that epithelial tissue is really important in a lot of these responses, as epithelial tissue forms the interface between the animal and its external environment, or between an organ and the rest of the body. And so this epithelial tissue is often packed with sensors that detect temperature, and pain, and pressure, and other stuff like that. Maintaining homeostasis and having epithelial tissue that can contribute to that maintenance is really important. This is because the animal possesses enzymes and other kinds of biochemicals that all engage in reactions only under a very specific set of circumstances, like in the proper pH or under the right temperature. When the animal's internal conditions start to move out of any of these comfort zones for any reason, like maybe the pH starts getting a little too low or the temperature starts getting a little too high, the body will receive sensory feedback, and then it will engage in regulatory responses, like panting or shivering or something. So this is a process of negative feedback, where any environmental input that pushes the animal out of homeostasis will cause a feedback response that tries to limit that change and pull the animal back into homeostasis. I want to take a closer look at heat management, because heat management is a near universal thing that all animals have to deal with, and because it also has to do with biology growing upon physical laws. The physical laws, the physics of this, involve the movement of heat through a medium, and how heat can be released or lost to the environment. There are several ways to do this. Conduction and convection involves heat moving from one mass into another through direct physical contact. Conduction, for example, is the flow of heat through a solid, like your stovetop heating your frying pan. Convection is the flow of heat through a fluid medium, like water or air, which is how your oven bakes the chicken that you eat for dinner. And then there's the third method of heat loss, which is radiation. The heat is literally lost as infrared radiation coming off of the animal's body. Perhaps most important for animals is evaporation, where heat is taken away as liquid water evaporates into gas. Building off of these physical laws of heat flow, animals have evolved means of regulating their internal temperature, which is called Thermo Regulation. There's an interesting dynamic here, where animals fall somewhere along two gradients. One gradient is concerned with how the tissue is heated. On one end, you have endotherms, which produce their own heat through their own metabolic activity. This is like a mammal, like you and me. And then you have ectotherms. Ectotherms heat their body with the ambient heat of the environment, and these are like reptiles. Now there's the second gradient, which is concerned with heat management in the face of an unforgiving environment. On one end, you have homeotherms, which keep their internal temperature relatively constant despite the external temperature of the environment maybe fluctuating or being warmer or colder. And then on the other end, you have heterotherms, which allow their body temperature to rise or fall in accordance with the external temperature. It's important to understand that very few animals exist at any of the extremes of these gradients. Most animals have mixed responses to varying degrees. For example, a human left out in the cold will generally see a very small decrease in internal body temperature, even after regulatory responses have kicked in to fight off the cold. So this involves mostly homeothermy, but a little bit of heterothermy. In contrast, a reptile engages in minor homeothermic regulation just to avoid the temperature extremes, but by and large, they keep themselves warm just by exposing themselves to the hot ambient air, or by lying on a rock that's been warmed by the sun. The point is, animals don't usually work in absolutes. Now, animals like mammals and birds have relatively fast metabolic rates, with the activity of their cells generating enough heat to keep their body warm. Reptiles, in contrast, have low metabolic rates, and they warm themselves by living where it's hot, so that the hot air and the hot ground can keep their bodies warm. But like all adaptations, there are fitness trade-offs here. Endotherms have to eat a huge amount of food to sustain their high metabolic rate, but this gives them an improved capacity to tolerate colder environments. And then in contrast, you have ectotherms, which don't have to eat nearly as often. Like a snake, for example, can have a meal about once a week, and this is because its metabolic rate just isn't that high. It's not generating enough heat to keep its body warm. This also means that ectotherms are sensitive to lower temperatures, as the low temperature can cool their body off and lower their metabolism to the point where they become sluggish and lethargic, and this makes them vulnerable to predation. Then you have certain morphological structures that are also used for heat regulation. Large, thin, heavy vascularized ears, like you would see on a fennec fox or on an elephant, are very good at regulating heat, as warm blood will circle through this thin tissue and dissipate heat out into the air. The large surface area makes them great for radiating and convecting away heat, and the blood vessels often lie right up next to the surface of the skin so that the heat has a very short distance to travel. You can also see this kind of morphology on the legs of desert-dwelling animals. A lot of desert-dwelling creatures, particularly mammals, will have very long, very thin legs, but you'll be able to see a heavy vascularization wrapping around the bone and the muscle. And this is because their legs are like these radiators, almost. The legs allow all of this hot blood to flow through them and leak the heat away out into the somewhat cooler air. It helps cool them down. There's 1,000 different ways that animals regulate their heat, from cellular processes to macroscopic morphology to various behaviors. There's thousands of other things besides heat that animals also have to regulate, like osmolarity, respiration, digestive wastes, you name it. Maintaining homeostasis means balancing all of these things, and it's critically important and virtually all-encompassing because it involves almost every part of the animal's chemical physiology. everything I've talked about today, everything in this episode, it's all been examples of form following function, as the biological substrate evolves to grow around and exploit a framework of physical laws. These are the fundamentals of animal physiology. And with that, I've come to the end of the episode. Now, this was a really long episode, but it was really interesting. At least I thought it was really interesting. This stuff is really cool. And the information here is really important to understand how animal bodies work, and what influences are directing and shaping animal evolution. Join me next week as I'll continue this second series on animal physiology by exploring gas exchange in animal organisms. So if that sounds cool to you, if gas exchange and respiration and, animal breathing sounds like something you'd want to learn about, then be sure to come by and check it out. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.